Yeah, I'm on it.
Okay. Hello. So you are here for actually, Timothy. Do you wanna roll our introduction? Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chinese Marxism number 13 by Capital Comrades.
Zero Books, Capital Comrades.
God. Yeah, sorry. There we go. First mistake. Okay. Anyway, so we are finishing up the third and last volume of Deng's selected works, spanning from 1989 to 1992. And with that, after Deng, we'll be going over to Xi and reading The Governance of China, Volume 1. And then that will complete our series somewhere around the end of May or early June.
Yeah, and I think that'll be, by the way, guys, sorry, we're just sharing the group, so we're going to tune in more in a second. But I think, so there'll be 5 more sessions after this, I think. So you can do the calendar work. But yeah, because after this, we're going to do The Governance of China, Volume 1, which I got to say, I was reading through, and I'm sure there's some interesting stuff in there, but I was reading through the first few chapters, and my God, that is dry. That is really a dry read. He makes Deng seem quite iconoclastic. But again, I do think it's just interesting to discuss these things and go over them, and and there are it's one thing you get in the name of reform. The style of the style of writing you see in the Xi text is amazingly unflamboyant. The C text, I should say. But one thing you do kind of see in it, is that in the name of reform, he launches a fairly sweeping agenda, shortly after, assuming the position of pinnacle power in China, 2012, 2013. So hopefully that'll be, interesting to see. 1 second. Okay, and I'm almost done with the sharing. But today we actually have quite a. Today we have, I hope people stick with us as the weather gets better. I guess it depends on where you are. But today we have quite an interesting session because, as we've said before, we're going to be going through this will be the final session we're doing on Deng Xiaoping today, and we have three readings, 3 texts here. Just let me pull it up. Yeah, we have Let Us Put the Past Behind Us and Open Up a New Era, addressed to officers at the rank of general and above in command of the troops enforcing martial law in Beijing, and excerpts from talks given in Wuchang, Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Shanghai. So these are actually all really pivotal, very pivotal texts, right? And there was a lot of things going on toward the end of Deng Xiaoping's tenure, right? So in the first of these, Let Us Put the Past Behind Us and Open Up a New Era, what you see is the beginnings of the end of the Sino-Soviet split, right? As we know, pretty much, from the early 60s onward, though it subsequently intensified, there was a great deal of animosity between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. And that played a very, very decisive role in shaping the overall direction of the Cold War, right? Because by driving a wedge between Russia and China, America was able to weaken, I think, the communist camp considerably. And, in many ways in this period, the animosity was so emphatic that China was wont to ally itself with the United States on key international issues over the Soviet Union. Though they still did always maintain an array of localized communist allies, of course. North Korea being the oldest, sort of perhaps the strongest kind of Chinese proxy in that respect. As for the second essay, addressed to officers at the rank of general and above in command of the troops enforcing martial law in Beijing from 1989, this is just a speech that Deng gives a few days after the massacres in Tiananmen Square, right? So he's in this position of this terrible thing having happened, thousands of people, we don't know an exact number, but thousands of people killed by the government. And he's trying to rally morale and sort of justify, this decision in the aftermath of it. And in the third text, And by the way, I should say about the one about the Sino-Soviet split, that has a lot of significance for today, right? Because you see this kind of regional alliance between Russia and China, right? That's being shaped. And it's interesting, right? Because that regional alliance is that's the first time you've seen really, really active regional cooperation between Russia and China since probably the 50s, right? So quite significant in that respect. Nearly a century. Okay. Now, in the third text, we have excerpts from talks given in Wuchang, Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Shanghai, 91 to 92. And this is a little different, the structure, because in that text, you have excerpts of talks that he gave over a certain period of time. And this was as Deng was approaching retirement, though he did exercise, a lot of control in the communist system until his death in, I think, 97 or 98, right? Which was, kind of nice in a way, because the Hong Kong handover was 97. And Deng, he always said, I want to live to see the Hong Kong. And he made it like 1 year, right? Just that.
Worth it.
Actually, if you ever watch you can probably see I've got a poster of the Wong Kar-wai film, In the Mood for Love. But if you ever see his Happy Together film about a couple of gay Cantonese couple who relocate to Buenos Aires, there's a part where, you see the news kind of throughout it. So there's a part where like you see the Hong Kong handover, and then you see the death of Deng Xiaoping. So these events are kind of broadcast, into this Latin American frame, right, as they're living there. But those things happen close by. The third one is so I said about the third one. So they're excerpts from different talks. Now that's from something called the Southern Tour that Deng gave in 91 and 92. And basically what was happening was that there were people, so he had relinquished a certain amount of control because he was very, very old in that time. Remember, Deng didn't take power until he was like 70, I think, right? So, he even had hearing difficulties, right? Which was like an obstacle when he was in power. Like at a certain point, it was hard for him to hear what people were saying. So he'd have like someone who would tell him what people were saying. They'd like whisper, in his ear. So as regards the, Deng never got to watch Bruce Lee kick ass. Okay. I don't know. As regards the, he was alive for that.
Maybe he did.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, that was the early 70s. He would have been in Cultural Revolution exile, I think, pretty much, in the period of Bruce Lee's success. But this Southern Tour, what happened was that Deng's had relinquished a certain amount of control. And because of the opening up, there was one thing Deng had confronted since he first sort of assumed a position of primacy, the foremost position of power in the party around 1980, though he gets very powerful even like in 78. He had, there were people who were always concerned about the adverse impacts of growth, right? And they were saying like, slow down, set realistic growth targets. We don't want to like overheat the economy and this kind of thing. And after the events of Tiananmen Square in particular, Deng, he became very, very adamant that they should continue to try to encourage economic growth at a high pace. Because his basic thing was like, if we didn't fall like the Soviet Union, it was because of economic growth. So we have to keep that going in a period where there's obviously political discontent in order to build, sort of consent amongst the people, right? So he presented himself, it was an interesting intervention because like, in a way, in the Southern Tour, he was going also to these places, and remember, this is significant. He was going to places like Zhuhai and Shenzhen that were so enriched because of the fact they were made special economic zones, right? In the late 70s. So he was going to places like that. I think the late 70s. He's going to places like that, and we know because we've read it. It's just the date. He was going to places like that, and he was doing these like as I understand, relatively open. Sort of talks with local party members, but also kind of incorporating the public. And it was kind of this. You got to remember like that his whole prestige was weakened a lot by what happened in Tiananmen Square, right? And the United States slapped sanctions on China for like a year, I think. And this is where you see the importance of China being as big as it is, because the United States couldn't really succeed in maintaining those sanctions because they were too damaging to their own trade. Actually, George Bush Sr., he apparently, he was the one, I think, who started to, even I think when he was, like, I think he had a good relationship with China. And I think even when he was vice president, with Reagan, there was a bit of like downplaying this. It was a bit like, okay, well, just, we'll work it out eventually, because it was the economies had already become indissociable to some extent. So
yeah,
but
much like Deng in the second speech, right? About that.
Yeah, what does he say about that?
That they'll figure it out later.
Yeah. Well, he also says at one point, he says like, don't worry about sanctions. We've always been sanctioned. Like, this is like the perennial reality of our lives. But you got to remember that it damaged his prestige a lot, and that was part of the reason why oppositional voices in the party started to become more visible. So the Southern tour was very significant because it was like Deng trying to show that like the will of the people was on the side of like continually accelerated economic growth. And he went to these places like Zhuhai and Shenzhen, where his reputation is arguably the looms the largest over the population at large because of the impact of opening up and the enrichment of those areas, and a lot of investment from Hong Kong and cheaper labor, frankly, and other areas, of course, but Hong Kong was the base of that in Guangdong, in that investment. And he went there, and he presented himself as this sort of like sagely paternal grandfather, and people were like, oh yeah, like Deng, yeah, like coming out like through those streets, like, oh hey Deng, like so good to see you, like this kind of thing. And he was like going to shops, right? It was this whole like very public kind of thing. Yeah, and it's interesting because like in the Chinese Communist Party, this is considered like it's very risky to do stuff like this for most people.
Yeah, we do that a lot here in Latin America. And 20 years ago, a candidate for PRI was he was assassinated by doing that. He was having a rally and he got shot in the head.
Well, maybe that's a risk in Mexico. I mean, I had a different risk in mind in China. Yeah. Well, the risk is what I mean is that flamboyancy is really actively discouraged.
Oh yeah, sure.
This whole like making the pitch,
plain living. Yeah.
Yeah, like, well, it's this political, like, it's this idea, like, because they're, and I think it's also like a reaction to the Cultural Revolution, because there was this real, like, almost like fear of extensive public mobilization after that because of what happened. And obviously Mao was going directly to the public to make his case, right? Mao even said, like, Mao at one point even threatened to, like, start a new revolutionary party in the countryside and to, like, wage the revolution again in order to get rid of, like, the comprador class.
Yeah.
But so there's a real sensitivity about like, using your political power and like going to the public and making your pitch in this way, for better or for worse. Like, I'm not judging her. This is what it is.
No, it's effective. Yeah.
It's a very effective way to communicate. Right. But it's sort of thought of as like cheating a little bit because you're supposed to they have democratic.
Who doesn't want to cheat, right?
Yeah. Well, people do it. Right. And it's this thing they indulge sometimes, but you got to understand, it's very delicate. And now the thing about it is, in a way, it was like for Deng to do that in the Southern tour, in a way, he was like flexing muscle a little bit. Yeah. Because like what he was showing is like, his status had become so unrivaled, even if he wasn't operating all the levers of power.
Yeah. In fact, the candidate that I mentioned that was assassinated, that was the reason why he was assassinated. He was pushing his own particular popular power over the party's power, and the party killed him.
Yeah. Again, I always stress China not such a morbid context. Yes. There's some issues about I don't know exactly what happened to Lin Bao, but but in general, that plane that crashed. Well, someday I don't know about that, but but no. I mean, the point is that I don't think and this is what's crucial about Deng doing that, is that I don't think Deng knew like no one could really do anything to him. Who's going to do something to him, right? Like it's like, because the post Tiananmen in that period, like the stability of the system was so inextricable from his image. So he knew he had that political credibility to use, right? So he was going to use it. So, and obviously he felt very strongly that accelerated, keeping up economic growth was really important to political stability. And so he went and he did that, and yeah, it was like this big, it was this sort of vulgar, kind of thing. Like it was like really like him like holding babies. I don't know if that actually happened, but like this was sort of.
I can believe it. I can definitely believe.
Yeah. And there was this real like, and actually, it's interesting about it's very interesting about Shenzhen, right? Which is now like one of our, it's because traditionally, even when I was a kid, we said like, Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, right? Now it's like Beijing, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, right? You got to talk about Shenzhen, and Shenzhen may be the big, Chinese city in the future because it has the manufacturing and it has the tech, right? Yeah. So, those are strong cards. Shanghai has a lot of things, Pudong, there's a lot of finance, they got film, they got other stuff. But I think the core of the economy, in Shenzhen more than the private economy in Shenzhen more than any other city. So you got, it's actually interesting to note in Shenzhen, and I'd like to know the date this was built, but I know that Shenzhen is like the one city pretty much where, because Deng wasn't like this cult of personality guy so much, other than the southern tour is like his one flashing moment of that, right?
Sure, yeah.
But I think Shenzhen is like the only city where like there's a big monument to Deng, and it's like more prominently displayed. There's a big banner and a monument, and it's actually more prominently. Does someone want to pull that up and share the screen? The monument.
Sure, let me find it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's like a Leninist monument almost.
Do you want to pull that up? Yeah, in the screen.
Sure. Yeah.
And there's a banner as well. You'll see. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay, we'll see. I don't see the banner, but we'll find it. I'm sure. Share.
Yeah, it's this kind of gaudy painting of him.
Share. Screen. All right. Right. Yeah, you can see my screen. Is this the monument?
Yeah, I'll put it in there. Yeah. So you can see this is the big statue of Deng, and I think this is like the major. It does speak to the uniqueness of It does speak to the that was considered politically significant, by the way, when Xi went there. Did that?
Is this the banner?
That's it. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, there you go. Okay. So it's somewhat politically significant, right? Because it speaks to the unique status of Shenzhen as a city, because Shenzhen is a city that so clearly owes its development to the specific policies implemented by Deng. And I don't think there's any other. I mean, I could be mistaken, but I don't think there's any other major Deng statue worship shrine in China. I think that's the major one. So yeah. So if you're ever down in Shenzhen, I don't think there's a lot to do that's touristic over there. But if you ever end up in Shenzhen, which you may yet,
picture with the banner, yeah.
Yeah, you may yet, given its economic importance. I do recommend you, unless you're appalled by this sort of thing, I do recommend you go check out the Deng statue and this wonderful Deng.
Yeah, I am looking into. I mentioned it to you before. Zhengzhou.
Zhengzhou, okay.
Yeah. It's nearby, so I could take a train. China has some great trains, right?
Yeah, no, it'd be good you should go check out Guangdong and Hong Kong also if you can. I don't know how your visa status is. As a Canadian, I can go to Hong Kong, but not China. Without a visa. I don't know how that works for Mexicans, but
I'll have to investigate.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a weird double system, right? People from Western countries where they do a lot of business have access to Hong Kong, but not other parts of China, right? So it speaks to the status of China as very connected economically with the West, but still, a certain level of hostility, right? Okay, so do you guys want to hop into this then? We'll get going with this. Okay. So.
Oh, great food. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
So let us put the past behind us and open up a new era. So the context of this is the possibility of a major summit meeting between Gorbachev and Deng, right? To put behind them some of the problems of the past. And I think at this point the Soviet Union was severely weakened, and I don't think it was really in the position to kind of stretch its legs as much as in the past. So I think Gorbachev, being a fairly amicable guy, whatever else, I think that Gorbachev was trying to seek a solution in that respect. Does anyone have any? I've got just a few little things highlighted here, 3 little things. I don't know if anyone had anything they want to bring up about this essay.
Yeah. When I was reading it last week and talking with my girlfriend, something that we we usually I usually try to discuss this text with her to see if I can draw something about the current situation and so on. And so what I highlight was this sentence in the second paragraph where Deng says, "Now, looking back on more than 20 years of practice, we can see that there was a lot of empty talk on both sides." Right? And I think that this kind of looking back into the past, and I think we went into this last talk, right? Looking at the periods of our own development, we sometimes lack this sober outlook, and
Yeah.
we romanticize how the relations in the past, right? So Deng goes into this disagreement over the border, right? And he says how this was something signed by the Soviet Union, but rather by Tsarist Russia and the Qing dynasty. Qing dynasty, is it? King dynasty. All right, the Qing dynasty, and how nevertheless he says explicitly, they are willing to settle border disputes on the basis of those treaties, right? And that reminded me a lot of this same relationship that Mexico had with the United States, right? Where we lost Texas and California and so on. And what usually goes on here when we're discussing that topic in Mexico is that people just kind of flip out and go into this nationalist rage about how we deserve those territories and we deserve, and if you actually look into the history, there was no way that we could actually bring those territories into the Mexican Republic, right? We just did not have the same culture. And I know it's not relevant to this specific text, but I was reading about the relationship also between the Soviet Union and Ukraine, right? And how this whole famine was not just about planning, but about culture, right? About how Ukraine was simply seen as not part of Soviet culture, right? And I think that sometimes this kind of sober looks at the past can help us, as Deng says, move forward.
Yeah. Does he give so he talks about how Russia sees more than 1.5 million square kilometers of Chinese territory during the Tsarist era. And he gives, of course, a few other. He doesn't just single out Russia here. He talks about Japan and other places. But does he?
Portugal,
which is Macau. Yeah, but does he? Here, does he he says that nevertheless, since more than 1.5 million square kilometers were seized under the treaties, and in view of past and present realities, we are still waiting to settle border. Okay, so what I guess what he's saying here is that these border disputes, which have been longstanding points of tension, and I think even in Xinjiang, by the way, that's been an issue because I think Russia had been supporting some of the earlier, right, during the Sino-Soviet split, they'd also supported Uyghur separatists. So I guess he's saying this is this is the big question in the room that we have to address, right? So there's still all of these border disputes that need to be finalized, and I'd be curious. It's hard to read around all these things as much as we'd like, but I'd be curious to know how that progressed over time. I'm sure it's very, very complicated, but it would be an interesting thing to dig into. And he talks about here. He talks about encroachments after the October Revolution. In 1929, the Soviet Union seized the Hexazi Islands. When victory in the Second World War was in sight, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union signed in the Yalta Agreement, dividing up spheres of influence among them, greatly to the detriment of China's interests. This was the period under Stalin. At that time, the Kuomintang government signed a pact with the Soviet Union, recognizing the arrangements of the Yalta Agreement. And by the way, remember that under Stalin, the Chinese communists had been encouraged to sign a pact with the Kuomintang. Do you remember that? So Stalin was willing to cooperate with the. Actually, lost the window. Stalin was willing to cooperate with the Kuomintang insofar as that forwarded the interests or the defeat of fascism more generally, right, and the extension of Russian interests. Sorry, 1 second. I'm just looking for my. Yeah, here we go. So that's a factor. But what do we got here? So in the In the 1960s, the Soviet Union strengthened its military presence all along the borders between China and the Soviet Union and Mongolia. The number of missiles was increased to 1/3 of the Soviet Union's total, and troops were increased to 1 million, including those sent to Mongolia. Where was the threat coming from? Naturally, China drew its conclusions. In 1963, I led a delegation. I like this, such a weird, like, rhetorical question. In 1963, I led a delegation to Moscow. The negotiations broke down. I should say that starting from the mid-1960s, our relations deteriorated to the point where they were practically broken off. I don't mean it was because of the ideological disputes. We no longer think that everything we said at that time was right. The basic problem was that the Chinese were not treated as equals and felt humiliated. However, we have never forgotten that in the period of our first 5-year plan, the Soviet Union helped us lay an industrial foundation. So he's talking about sort of the 50s and the early days of. And it's actually interesting here because one thing, you got to remember that the whole dispute between China and Russia was codified in ideological terms. So this, like, supposedly the Soviet Union had calcified into this, like, communist bureaucracy that was, like, attempting to broker peace with capitalists and was unable to foment, like, global third world revolution. And China was going to swoop to the rescue, and Mao had succeeded Stalin as the great global figure of revolution, and so on. And this affected the relations of different groups as well. Like there was an article published in the People's Daily, like in the early 60s, that dealt with it was like the differences between us and Conrad Togliatti. So it was like an attack on because the Italian Communist Party was like a rather openly reformist party that was still directly affiliated with the Soviet Union and received its support. So China just this is really random, and I think at another point in this text, Deng remarks that he apologized to the later Italian Communist Party, Enrico Berlinguer. But this was like really random, where China was just launching attacks at like random Soviet allied like reformist parties in Europe. It was just like not, it's just got like really messy.
Yeah.
And embarrassing. I know Togliatti, prior to his death, was trying to mediate between the Soviet Union and China while still remaining sort of on the Soviet side. But in any case, one of the first gestures Deng makes here when he discusses this topic is he says like, I don't really think we have any right to talk about how countries should pursue like revolution or communism, because all our conditions are different, and you talk about that. But I think this is the point of his essay. I do think there are outstanding issues that have to be addressed, right? So he'd earlier, right, in an earlier thing we read, he pointed to the issue with the Russian support of Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, right, as being a major issue. So you see these issues are, there are these different issues, and also just pointing to the fact that like, at a time, and it's crazy today to think, by the way, like, you talk about them being less powerful than the Soviet Union, like, and really think about that, like much less powerful. I mean, it's crazy today to think that the GDP per capita of China and Russia is like about the same, but China has like 4 times the population. So, but also keep in mind as well, right? Something else, and generally like, the Russia kind of went down, and then it kind of went up like a little bit, whereas China's just been like, like very straight line, right? But that's also interesting though, because it shows you that like, for all this talk of China's like ascendance as well, do remember that it's only been like in the last few years that China's equaled Russia's, per capita economic level, right? So, the ascendancy, the sense of its ascendancy is obviously rendered more pressing because of the sheer size of its population. But I mean, like, we should keep in mind when we're discussing China that like, it's not that high GDP per capita. It's basically like, it's not, I don't think it's significantly different than Brazil or Russia or, it's
or Mexico.
or Mexico. Yeah. Sometimes people talk about China.
Much larger.
Sometimes people talk about China in this weird way. Like, the States is so behind. Like, China's just killing it. It's like, yeah, like they have nice trains and stuff, but like, come on, like, it's like you can't compare like overall economic development of China to the States. I mean, of course, China doesn't have to be as economically developed as the States to surpass it in terms of geopolitical power. That's a reality.
Right.
And that actually can have benefits for development to the extent that, like, it shows they'll be able to tilt world affairs in a way that is opportune for them with a relatively lower per capita GDP point because of the size of the population. So that's decisive. But I just mean that, like, let's not lose sight of the fact that, like, they have, there's stronger infrastructure, there's probably better political organization, and so on and so forth. But let's not lose sight that dollar for dollar, we're not talking about something so different than Mexico, Brazil, Russia.
Right. And as Sander is saying, what about the level of inequality? Right. Much more extreme.
In where?
In China. Yeah. Like regionally, from region to region.
Than the States. Yeah. But overall quality, I think, is lower in the States.
Just checking it. The China's a Gini coefficient.
Yeah.
Which is the measure here. It's around, it's between 0 and 1, and it's 0.47, and it says the United States is 0.41 as of February of this year. So a little bit more inequality on China's side, but I imagine that's a fairly new development having to do with the tech industry.
Yeah, I had looked actually. Yeah, I looked at one from a few years ago, and it was like a bit lower. But yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, a lot of inequality. You know, obviously, like in terms of inequality, China's is not substantially different than it's like any capitalist state in that respect. And that if you were trying to, there are different ways, obviously, because of the inherent ambiguity of China's position to approach it. Certainly if you were trying to make a case for the singularity of the Chinese system, you'd be looking more at, the role of the government in the functioning of the economy, ratio of public to private assets and things like that. Right. Year by year public investment and figures like that, which are very exceptional and totally different than what you get in the West. Right.
I will say, yeah, because like I'm looking at some long-term numbers here, and like in China, it really peaks up. It gets a lot higher in 2008, but it seems like there was an active effort to get it down. But in the United States, it's just a continual trend of up and up. So we're actually,
you'll see that with the C parts, by the way. You'll see that like inequality is like a theme that's addressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense just based off of when Xi took power, because like it really went down by a lot when Xi took power.
Yeah. Well, it also has to do with the weakening of export markets, I think, which weakens private capital in some respects, right?
Okay.
Like when Western countries are like recessing, right? Mm-hmm. That can be, it weakens like the Chinese, a lot of the Chinese private sectors depend on export products, right? I remember Jayant Bhandari. I don't know if I debated this Jayant Bhandari guy. He said that. He said, yes, the public sector exists in China, but like all the products, they're not public sector, it's private sector. It's like, well, that doesn't really tell you much about like the overall significance of it to the economy. It just tells you that like
it's just the export sector.
Yeah, it's just export sector. Like, but those are the kind of arguments he made, right? In that. He's like, yeah, China's the most capitalist place I've ever been. You can go to a bank at 8 p.m. It's like, okay. Those are, but actually the reason for that, and I want to say also the reason for that is because China doesn't have it has to do with a lack of welfareization, basically, right? So like, if you look at it and you say, well, the inequality is similar to like a Western capitalist state, it's because Western capitalist states don't have the same number of people working in the public sector and receiving, let's say, relatively generous wages, in those roles. As a ratio of the overall workforce. The public sector is not as broadly extended as in China, but because there's more extensive welfareization, look, you can't exactly juxtapose these things, but you get my point. Because there's more extensive welfareization on core social services, that makes up a certain amount of the gap, right? And it has big impacts on the mitigation of inequality, right? Mm-hmm. Beyond just the relative proportion of the populace that's employed in those things. Right. Because on one, like, I guess what I'm saying is there's two dimensions to it. Like if you establish a public Medicare system, on one hand, you're creating a sector in which there's public employees who are paid publicly. Right.
Sorry. Ender reminded me of one of Pandari's arguments, right? I don't know if you can see the comment.
Which one did he say?
Yeah, he says, why Marx says proletarian and bourgeoisie? You can just say rich and poor.
I don't think Bhandari said that. I think that was someone.
I hope not. I
think that was someone from PAMU who said that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hope so.
That's different. Yeah. But what I was saying is, if you set up social insurance, on one hand you're employing people to work in those sectors, and equality is created in that way, insofar as they're public employees. But on the other hand, you're directly mitigating the consequences of inequality, right? Insofar as the resources are concentrated in welfareization. So it kind of has like a double impact.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm saying China employs a lot more people publicly. That's my understanding of it, right? Or in any case, there's a lot more capital invested in those sectors. But because there isn't welfareization, you're not getting that double impact as much. Now, there is welfareization, just not to the same degree, right? And often it's regionally structured, if you understand, right? So sorry, that was kind of complicated. As regards this essay in general, I wanted to point out as well he also has the thing here on Lenin was a true and great Marxist because it was not books that enabled him to find the revolutionary road and to accomplish the October Socialist Revolution in backward Russia, but realities, logic, philosophical thinking, and communist ideals. It was not by reading the work of Marx and Lenin that the great Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong learned how to accomplish the new democratic revolution in backward China. Could Marx predict that the October Revolution would take place in backward Russia? Could Lenin foresee that the Chinese revolutionaries would win by encircling the cities from the countryside? So I do love this like very, very knee-jerk, like reflexive Dengist, like, revolutionary pluralism kind of thing, which you kind of get in there. Right? I always have to read those because I think they're funny.
No, they're great. They're great.
Yeah. There's only one thing I shall have left undone in my lifetime: the resolution of the Taiwan question. By the way, earlier he had said like I might get this done in my lifetime, but I think now he shifted to an attitude of pessimism regarding reunification with Taiwan. I'm afraid I shall not live to see it. In foreign affairs, I've participated in accomplishing the following. We have readjusted our relations with Japan, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and we've decided to recover Hong Kong and have reached an agreement with Britain in that regard. I love the decided to recover Hong Kong. That's a great. In domestic affairs, I've participated in defining the party's basic line, deciding to concentrate on modernizations, adopting the policies of reform and opening China to the rest of the world, and upholding the four cardinal principles. What I have not accomplished is to abolish the system of life tenure in office. That is an important problem concerning the system of leadership. So that's an interesting point as well, because I believe toward the end of the Dengist era, there was a system set up of like term limits that were supposed to be respected, right, for leaders. But I think now with Xi, that's sort of being ignored, right? So it's shifting more to like a law. Yeah, it's shifting more to like, and I think now the question is like, is she going to stay on, right? And some people are saying he's going to revive the chairman title, right? And take that. Other people are saying he's going to remain. I think he's president now, right? Some people are going to say that I know I always sound like an idiot when I discuss these titles, but you got to understand like how fluid and weird the Chinese system is with this.
Yeah, Deng talks about it.
General Secretary, and President, yeah. So he became General Secretary in 2012 and President in 2013. Yeah. Deng talks about what? Sorry, you were saying?
About their fluid system and how it's much, much better than the one in the West.
What does he say? Where does he say that?
I think it's probably in the one about Tiananmen. He says that they wouldn't shift to the Western three power system.
Oh yeah,
the bourgeois republic.
Yeah, and that's I mean, like, though you can argue that when it's interesting, right? Because you can argue that by bringing business people into the Communist Party, which happened under Jiang Zemin, though I think maybe this was supported by Deng, you can argue that they shifted the base of power in a way, right, to allow these mediations to occur within the central party. So, because I think, this is one of the things they were trying to avoid, was having like different segments of civil society being pit against each other, right? In the context of different representative chambers, right?
Yeah.
So, but again, I just mean that they also extend their base, right? In the context of whom the party encompasses, right? Do you have any thoughts on that, Timothy? Any thoughts on this one?
No, we touched on what I wanted to touch on already. So I didn't have that much to say about this one.
Okay.
Should we move on?
Yeah, let's move on. Yeah. So now we have
address to officers at the rank of general and above in command of the troops enforcing martial law in Beijing, June 9, 1989.
Sorry, continue. Sorry, June 9. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay, June 9. I just want to add quickly. I found this is from a different essay, but I found a really funny quote here, which I liked. Deng says he talks about he's talking about the problem of party cliques, and then I guess he's trying to address the fact that Mao would have had to have a clique before he came to power, right? And sort of the potential contradiction which is engendered by this. And he writes, while in Jiangxi in the 1930s, I was regarded as a member of the Mao faction, but it was not true. there simply was no Mao faction. so I really like that. It's like it was a faction, but because it like embodied already like the collective interests of the Chinese people, we cannot.
There's no faction.
Yeah, there was no faction. We can't regard it as a faction. It's a nice retrospective note there. There was no Mao faction. That would be a good. I think these volumes need titles. I think one of them, a good title for the first volume, would be "There Was No Mao Faction" in selected works of Deng Volume 1. So here we have June 9th, 1989. So I believe was Tiananmen Square, was that June 5th? Is that right? The massacre, I mean, June 4th.
It was 4th, yeah.
Yeah. The basic, just to describe a little bit what happens here, and I read about this in Ezra Vogel's book. The basic, so you have, I had always, like, I think in the West, like, we don't really have, there's not much cognitive mapping of Tiananmen Square and what really happened, so it's important to discuss that. What you had over quite an extended period of time, I think it was like 6 months or something, you had like, now Tiananmen Square, as we've seen, actually different times throughout this book, has been a flashpoint for protests and so on in China. And that had been something that happened, I think, no less than 3 or 4 times throughout Deng's tenure. In what you had a buildup that proceeded for really like sort of a 6-month period, right, of people occupying the square. And at this time, very different than today, where a lot of the anti-government sentiment today is more neo-Maoist, maybe in character, more left-wing. At that time, now you got to remember, Tiananmen Square was first a student protest, right? And students were always strongly represented in it. So at that time, I think what you had throughout a lot of, the left had been really thoroughly quashed in those years. Like, it didn't have much power. There was a certain amount of consent that Deng commanded amongst, like, poorer segments of the population who'd been enriched, right, because of his reforms, who had seen their quality of life improve. There were others who were probably discontented, like the working class didn't see their living standard improve as much as they might have hoped. So they might have been discontented, but hadn't really coalesced into some kind of tangible activist movement, right? That happens a little more later before and during Xi's time. But if you look at what happens, so there's a very, very strong liberal element, right, to these protests, right? Where they're saying, they're seeing what's happening, right? With the unraveling of the Eastern Bloc. And I think particularly significant to all of this was what happened in Romania as well. And I'm trying to remember the exact contents, but because I think it was Ceausescu. Yeah, because, like, I guess they've been following the Romanian situation very, very closely, and I'm not so familiar with everything, with the whole details of that, but I do know, like, that what happened was that in Romania, the government sought to use force against like the movements which were occurring, and that there was actually, like, the leader was killed, right, and these kind of things. So, I believe as all this was going on, they were looking very carefully at Romania to try to gauge how effective, like, the use of force might be to quell these kind of things, and to look at it as sort of a laboratory. But in any case, you had all of these protests going on in the Eastern Bloc, and students were seeing this, a lot of them of liberal persuasion, because sort of like the burnout of the Cultural Revolution followed by this grandiose promise of opening up. For many, they could see sort of like, they had been galvanized by the opening up that had transpired, but they also understood the limitations of what could occur. Right. Because Deng had always pursued this sort of paradoxical mandate of, like, open up, but, build a market economy, but let's keep to the socialist line. Right. So this built up over several months. And at first, the first impulse of the party was to was to try to mediate, right, for the protesters. So there were several party members who went there, and they, they spoke to the students. They said, like, look, like when I was a student, I used to protest, and we're here. We need to have democracy eventually. That's certain. We're listening to you, But like one thing about Tiananmen Square, the protesters were really stubborn protesters. Like I don't think you really see the level of intensity in the States, and that's another thing we got to talk about, right? What was going down there? Like these were really hardcore, right? I think it was like dozens of soldiers and police who were killed, right? Who were trying to diffuse the protests earlier in those months, who were actually just killed, right? Like pulled off vehicles and like beaten to death by protesters. I think I might have read a number like 50 for that. There was a large number of military vehicles that were sabotaged and destroyed, right? As the protests swelled into like the hundreds of thousands, right? So it was this enormous social movement. And they made a pact at one point, the protesters, they were like, we're not leaving until China becomes like a full liberal democracy or we die, right? So this was very, very emphatic, right? And it spoke to this, which I think you can certainly sympathize with. It spoke to this, I think this deep discontent with political structures that was felt by, young people of a certain social class at that time.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And almost this kind of like, I said like this post-cultural revolution burnout, almost, a support of liberal democracy, and also, really a real like nihilistic bleakness regarding the commitments of the Chinese Communist Party, and the paradoxes that defined its leadership under Deng. So the what happened is that the intensity of this kept ramping up, and I think it reached a certain crucial point where they were going to have they were supposed to have a meeting where Gorbachev was going to come. And this, this is a bit like what we discussed earlier, right? He was going to come to Tiananmen Square, right? Because they have their public buildings around there and everything. And he was, they were going to have him there, and they were going to have a ceremony, and they were going to kind of like, Russia and China mending bridges, right? This, this was a really significant diplomatic event, and it couldn't happen, right? Because of the state of the square. And in fact, what was going on in the city was making government operation very difficult in of itself. Right, at this point, because like hundreds of thousands of people condensed around these buildings, and there was increasing talk and increasing discomfort amongst the certain echelons of the party, and people were beginning to say like, well, what are we going to do about this? Because this is getting really bad, guys. Like, if this continues, like, and they were looking at Eastern Europe, and they were like, if this continues, I don't know, right? Don't know if we're going to make it. It's pretty bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, at some point, I think there was one member of the party, he went out, he could sense what was going on, the kind of turn in the sentiments that were happening in the party. And he goes out and he goes to the crowd of students, and he's like, please, look, we're listening to you. Just like, please leave. You don't want to stay here. Like, you don't want to do this. Right? Like, I know what's going on. I'm feeling out the climate. Please leave. Like, don't do this. And students, they're just like, no, we're not going to leave. And he like started crying apparently on stage, like walked off because he could feel what was starting to happen, the turning, right, of the sentiment. And at one point, I think this was reaching a real head in May. Right, and weather was, in Beijing, right, weather as it gets warmer, right, that's another factor, right, because I think this had went through Christmas, and they were hoping that the I could be wrong, I'd have to look it up, but I think they were hoping that the meteoric changes would help, but it didn't. So, throughout May there was more talk, and Deng at one point, I think toward the end of May, he called a meeting. And he was like, look, no more. Like, no more. We can't do this. Like, this is done. We're done. If this continues, we're done. And that's a fact, right? Because we can see what's happening, right? He said, like, we're losing. He said, this is having such a dramatic effect that, like, you know, it's not just a question of protesters. It's like the People's Daily, like the editor is like quite sympathetic. You know, we're losing the support of like the overall society because of this, right?
Mhm.
And we're really fundamentally risking disintegration. And he was like, you're either in or you're out. You know, you're in or you're out. You're with me or you're against me. Right? I know it's a hard decision. I know it's not nice. Right? That's it. You do it or you don't. Right? And Deng, having taken that position and swung so, you know, and it was like this thing where they were starting to like, you know, when they made that shift, they started like expelling party members. They changed the editor of the People's Daily. That was the first sign that things were starting to really turn, right? Because they were starting to purge their own ranks to get rid of people who were perceived as having been too sympathetic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a sign that they felt that efforts to mediate had fundamentally failed.
Yeah.
Right? And you know, then on they gave an order. You know, they gave an order to troops on like June 4th, and they said they didn't say kill people.
They said evacuate the square, right?
Sorry, evacuate the square.
Yeah.
Use whatever force necessary to evacuate the square was the language, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you know what happened was no, you got to remember that one thing that had happened was to stop the military vehicles from coming in. The protesters had blocked the roads around the city, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So the military vehicles came in, and what had happened prior to that was like the military and stuff. They use like rubber bullets and stuff like that, you know, tear gas, stuff like this, and
Less than lethal weapons.
Yeah, well, yeah. So this was that, you know. So they asked the military. They were like, "You got to get out of the way. We're coming through," and you know, there was like a sort of half an hour, I think they spent like trying to get people to move, and they wouldn't. And then they kind of stood back and they shot, and people didn't know, you know, I think maybe the military had said, we're going to fire. I don't know what happened, but I don't think people really believed it, you know, like that was going to happen, you know, and then they stood back and just unleashed like a row of bullets, right. You know, at people. And that was that was to break the barrier. You know, and then they came through the square, you know, and you know, like the famous video in the West, the guy in the tank and all this stuff, right? You know, it was a big thing too, because there were people filming, you know, some people filming from windows, and the military would run up, right, to try to figure out who was filming, right? They were trying to block all the. It would be, imagine today, right, with phones, right? It's like totally different reality. But yeah, they cleared the square, and you know, people don't know how many died. I mean, Deng later on, he mocks Western media. He's like, people like 10,000 people died and stuff. No, right? You know, probably more sober projections. I'd have to look at it again. I think they range from like, you know, be like 1,000 or whatever. I don't know exactly the amount, but a lot anyway for what it is. But again, like I said, you have to, yeah. This is what Andrew's saying. The protesters didn't believe they were being shot. Yeah. There was this incredulousness to the whole response. People were like, you know, because I said, like, China's not a place where they're usually like calling the military to use weapons on their own people, right? That's not really part of its particular political legacy.
Right.
You know, it's like that in the Cultural Revolution, they never did that. I mean, there are people who died because of all kinds of street fights, you know, many more, I'm sure, but it was not the same kind of thing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that happened. And I think they cleared the square at some point that night, right, is when they got it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, you know, and they, you know, and then this is when Deng kind of gives the speech. And I said, you got to put it in context, because, you know, I think Deng, you know, it said that maybe he was responsible for the slaughter of a town of like 1,600 people during the Civil War. So you got to put in context that I think just that experience of the Civil War made him different than other people.
Yeah.
Right. In this, because it wasn't, you know, like to talk about 1,000 people, like numbers wouldn't have been unfamiliar. I'm not saying that compared to other leaders, he was exceptionally violent or something. He was faced with the choice, and many leaders have responded like that. Right. Mm-hmm. You know, we see similar things in many countries.
Mexico had the same response in 1968.
South Korea. Yeah. And in Greece, I think in 1967, right. You can go through it, and there's a lot of things.
The United States, in Kent State.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Canada used the War Measures Act, and not like it wasn't anywhere near as violent as Tiananmen Square, but the War Measures Act was used in 1972 in Quebec to arrest people en masse without warrant and this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But
Yeah, and you can run over protesters now in Florida, right?
And the state's pretty perverse, right? So this is what happened, but this is going to weigh really heavily on Deng, his reputation after that. And he ceases being like an international representative of the party really after that, to the same degree, certainly not in the West. And they actually begin phasing in a whole new generation of leadership, right? So if you look at a lot of these people in a way can be considered kind of avatars for Dengism. Like if you look at someone like Jiang Zemin and what he was doing, but it was really necessary beyond just the question of Deng's age. It was really necessary at that time to replace these people with people who weren't tarnished by that event. And that's why, that's also why when it happened, he was like, look, me and some of the older people, we're going to take responsibility for the call, and we're not going to have younger people who are promising in our party being deemed responsible for that. Right. So that was kind of what
congratulates them actually, right? He says
the army, I think. Which party are you talking about?
Yeah, he says, in short, this was a test and you passed it. There are not many veteran comrades in the army, and most of the soldiers are only 18 or 20, but they are still true men of the People's Army.
Yeah. So here he's kind of rallying morale. You can see, and he sticks to this thing. He says counter-revolutionary rebellion, right? Yeah. And the the major difficulty in handling it has been that we've never encountered a situation in which a handful of bad people were mingled with so many young students and crowds of onlookers. Since for the moment we were not able to distinguish between innocent and guilty, we could scarcely take the actions that should have been taken. Without the support of so many veteran party comrades, it would have been hard even to determine the nature of the incident. Some comrades did not understand its nature and thought we were only dealing with the masses. In fact, we were dealing not only with people who merely could not distinguish between right and wrong, but also with a number of rebels and many persons who were the dregs of society. They tried to subvert our state and our party. This is the crux of the matter. If we don't understand the fundamental question, we shall not be clear about the nature of the incident. And he goes on, the nature of the incident should have been obvious from the very beginning. And this is something, Deng himself had been somewhat more intolerant in his tendency, and he took the metamorphosing and the fact that this became more severe sort of as proof of his original sentiment, right? When this was happening, he's saying, like, you guys are kind of liberal idiots, you don't get it, right? Like there are forces which are for our party and against our party, and you have to understand, I think a lot of, especially with younger members of the party, I mean, a lot of them had been students who went to similar schools, and I think there was this, I guess it was just something I don't think people fully expected. I mean, students always protest and stuff, but I'm not sure if people really expected it to be, so existentially threatening, right? Because, and this is the thing, it's like, because a lot of these people are people who, like from good families, right? Whatever, like best schools, and they, and they were thinking like, oh, well, these are, it's a class of people who might be folded into the party at some point, and I think that, like they hadn't really understood the level of anxiety coming from that social demographic, right? I think that, oh yeah, they want democracy, like we'll get to it, okay, right? They didn't I don't think they understood how emphatic that sentiment was, right? And I think Deng understood a little better than other people, and it's interesting to put that in relation to what he says all throughout this about how we don't have a strong enough ideological line, right? Because he said that for a lot of years, right? So in a way, I think that poised him to kind of understand a little more how threatening that could be, right? Because he already saw there as being like an ideological problem, right? So I think you can see his suspicion a little bit. But the nature of the incident should have been obvious from the very beginning. The handful of bad people had two basic slogans: overthrow the Communist Party and demolish the socialist system. Their goal was to establish a bourgeois republic, an out-and-out vassal of the West. Naturally, we accepted the people's demand for a fight against corruption. We even had to accept as well-intentioned the so-called anti-corruption slogans of the bad individuals. Of course, these slogans were simply pretexts, and their ultimate aim was to overthrow the Communist Party and demolish the socialist system. So you see, he does it. He accomplishes an interesting double gesture here. He says, like, it's not that they were wrong, exactly, right? And Deng himself has addressed corruption, but he's like, they were instrumentalizing these, what is, this reminds me of Zizek, right? He said, it's not, he said, like, racists often will say things that are true, and that's actually the most dangerous kind of racism, right? Deng saying, like, I think this is part of, in a way you can kind of distill Deng's critique a little bit about that. I think he sees it, I don't think he's saying that when he says, like, some of them were bad people, I don't think his point is that what everyone's saying is wrong, right? I think his point is that this is being instrumentalized to overthrow our system, right? And so it's not innocent, right? It's not like, well, let's just change this, it's like, and not, I think there is, but I'm not saying it's not opportunistic, like this reading of events, but I do think that, again, in terms of the adamancy of the demands, and the real desire for a meteoric change, that there was a nucleus there that were really strongly supporting that. Probably maybe there were others who'd be like, yeah, anti-corruption, little democratization, it's good. But I think there was a nucleus that weren't interested in hearing people just say, like, we're going to democratize eventually. That wasn't enough, right? Any thoughts on this, by the way, guys? Any thoughts on this?
Tim?
Anything, Tim?
Yeah, I'm trying to see if there's anything else that I wanted to add. I
have a couple other notes, but you can continue.
Yeah, I don't know, because that the one that you just went over was one that I spent a fair amount of time thinking about. No, I think it makes an interesting when we get to the third piece. I think this, like, looking at the difference between the, like, taking something immediately versus understanding it through the whole of the system. At least that's the thought.
When he says that it's very important to stress when he says make into like a vassal of the West, because, like, he's framing it in a certain way, right? Because he's saying, like, these people, these sort of, like, liberal, students from relatively good families, that they're agents, the bad apples or whatever, they're agents of Westernization, right? And what and think of what this would mean for Deng to say this in light of his own life's experience, right? Like, what he's saying is they're trying to, like, break the political solidarity that we've built up and to support, like, the sort of balkanizing agenda of the colonizers, and then we go back to, imperialism, rent extraction, inability to set a strong public mandate. And again, it's like,
which is what happened all over Africa and Latin America and India, right? So it's not like they're, being hysterical or anything.
Yeah. Again, about I want to, certainly in this segment, it's a sensitive issue. I don't want to say anything to justify that. I just want to explain the context, which I think, is the best thing to do. And, I think his analysis of the situation, it's like what I said about what Zizek said, right? Like, Zizek was like, but I do think, I think it's horrible, but if this had happened, disintegration of China, imperialism, a terrible sort of fate, I'm like, I guess, without saying what's right, what's wrong, I just want to say, I think we owe it to ourselves to try to look at the complexity of the factors at play in the situation, and try to understand where people were coming from. Obviously a lot of people supported the government, people who weren't protesting, right? But that in of itself doesn't make it right. I just mean just try to understand the situations that produce this kind of situation in which you have, unstoppable force, immovable object, right? And how does that happen, right? Well, immovable object, unless certain means are used, right? So he talks a little bit here. He reflects a little bit. We have a tradition of hard struggle. During the next 60 or 70 years, we must make a point of educating people with the need for hard work and plain living. The more developed our country is, the more we need the pioneering spirit of hard struggle. Encouraging such a spirit will also help overcome corruption. After the founding of the People's Republic, we always stressed the need to build the country in that spirit. Later, when things were slightly better, we encouraged a high level of consumption, which resulted in the spread of extravagance and waste in every field. It was because of this, because of our poor performance in ideological and political work, and because of the incomplete legal system, the violations of the law and discipline, corrupt practices, etc., all came about. I've told foreign guests that during the last 10 years, our biggest mistake was made in the field of education, primarily in ideological and political education, not just of the students, but of the people in general. We didn't tell them enough about the need for hard struggle, about what China was like in the old days and what kind of country it was to become. This was a serious error on our part. So you see, he's not just talking about the students, right? He's talking about a whole cultural, ideological degeneration, right? Yeah. That you know, and it's like Marx says, right? All that solid melts into air, right? That's also coming about, you know, because of the introduction of market forces into society, without what Deng would perceive as a strong enough counterweight, kind of in the political and ideological front. But it's interesting because he links the students to corruption, right? And you know, I mean, he sees the students as you know, particularly the revolutionary nucleus, as you know, symptomatic of that. But he's also saying, you know, that this is like, these are really rampant problems in our society, and they speak to a similar kind of moral disaffection, right? Where people, they're not looking at, you know, they're not looking at the system and saying, I should serve the system, you know, look at this great legacy, look at what we've accomplished. You know, they're looking at it and be like, what can I get from me?
Yeah.
Right. And that's sort of what Deng attacks the students with. And what's partly implicit in this argument is that, you know, they're thinking too much about their own individual liberties and not enough about the collective welfare of the country. Right. Which is how it feeds into, like if you compare it with corruption, it's how it feeds into this, like, what I want. Right. So it's an interesting kind of thing to compare like corruption to Western liberalism. It's like well, not that he's the first one to do that, but it's interesting how it's rhetorically employed here. Right.
You know, I can't
and
remember.
It's pretty evident. Sorry, Tim?
Yeah, I can't quite remember the details. There was like in the new Adam Curtis series, there was one where like there was an interview with one of the lead student protesters from Tiananmen. Like I think I don't have any specific quotes in my head, but I think that if you listen to her, you can definitely see that spirit of the concern, the more individual concern taking precedence over collective ones. Like even in her own relationship to the students, like she talks about leaving. She knew there was going to be a massacre, but she wasn't going to be there with. She wasn't going to go through that with the students that were in the square. And there's kind of like you can see there at the level of the spirit, like the collective spirit was breaking down in that group right there.
Yeah, though there were people who insisted on staying right to the end, which is
but I just, at least if the leader and the one who then gets to speak to the Western media wasn't going to stay there, I think that says something.
Yeah. I mean, like I as far as I'm concerned, like the protesters in overall were extremely defiant. You know, and you know, if you could, through a certain lens, right, there's a kind of bravery, right? You know, people just like being like, well, I'm going to die. Okay. You know, and obviously that's not most people. Like most people are never going to do that. Right. But it kind of shows you like how vehement, right, that there was that aspect of it. So he talks a little bit here about so of course, after this happened, you know, the Western denunciations of China were broad and sweeping. And in many ways, you can argue that Chinese-American relations have never quite gotten to the level that they were prior to Tiananmen again after that. Because I think part of what happens is that after Tiananmen is that like it kind of, you know, a lot of people thought like Deng is just leading China to the liberal promised land, you know, and I think after Tiananmen, it corrects some of these illusions a little bit. And I think it hardened, you know, the West knows like the economic cooperation is still very high, but I think what it does is it instills a great skepticism, which is shared by a lot of the public toward the Chinese political system. Right. And this is really fundamental here, right? Because like, you know, one thing I think that you see with Deng is you can tell where he comes from, this like culture of self-criticism, because he's quite hard on himself, you know, a lot in the essays. And he's like, you know, and I think here you can see like, it's really, I think, you know, he's trying to keep up morale, but I think you can see he also sees it as quite a serious failure. Right. You know, it's like, this is, you know, it's like we failed ideologically, you know, like, which is not insignificant if you're like a Marxist leader. He's like, we did some domestic and international achievements, you know, that's great, but we failed. Ideologically, we failed. And we have not produced a vision for the Chinese people that is attractive politically. You know, we may have, you know, purchased a certain level of passivity because of economic reforms or there might be a certain public consent because of that, but we haven't transmuted that into a vision of the collective state that's really attractive, right? And so I think actually, if you look closely at this essay, I think you can see all the seeds of like, Xiism, like already here. And that's part of why it's such an important essay to read. I think you can see where he's, I think you can see where this creates the need for the notion of political renewal, right? Which isn't taken up, I think, in a serious way until, nearly 20 years later, right? In terms of building a notion of kind of using propaganda and building a notion of strong central leadership, right? He talks here about the United States. The United States has blamed us for suppressing the students, but didn't the U.S. itself call out police and troops to deal with student strikes and disturbances? And didn't that lead to arrests and bloodshed? It suppressed the students and the people while we put down a counter-revolutionary rebellion. I love this, by the way. What right has it to
great
criticize
framing.
us? Yeah. What right has it to criticize us? In future, however, we must make sure that no adverse trend is allowed to reach this point. I mean, like, so you also see, by the way, you also see like I don't think he's just making this stuff up in terms of his view. Like, I mean, I don't think it's insincere with respect to his own views. You also see how like this like hard Marxist side to his personality as well, right?
Yeah.
Where he's like, in America, in America when they kill protesters, that's like reactionary. Like when we kill protesters, that's putting down a counter-revolutionary rebellion. That's like,
when we do it, it's cool. It's
Yeah.
based. When we do it, it's cringe. Yeah, pretty much.
And by the way, I am a Marxist, so I do see the logic. I'm not saying I don't see the logic, but I also see how it can be abused.
So right, Mexico had its particular tragedy, and it's a big part of our political conscience. And how we have it framed is very like our reality is that it's very similar to how Deng calls out Western, authoritarianism. It was a movement by a political party that did not want dissent, but they did not have a policy of reform or of opening up, but rather of staying in line, right? And there was no 100,000 multitude of Mexicans, right, ready to start an armed revolution, right? There was no aggression by part of the students. In fact, the historical account is that there was an army platoon that infiltrated, right? They could all be recognized because they wore a single white glove. They called the Olympia Battalion. Yeah. Olympia, because this was all in preparation for the 1968, I think, Olympics in Mexico.
Yeah.
Right. And, the president was very concerned that the Olympics couldn't be carried out, right? So you could see here that the concern was with keeping a TD image to the West, right, to the neighbor, instead of cultural unity, right, or an actual political program. This was only about saving face. Oh, yeah. Sorry, just to finish. And the platoon that infiltrated, right? So they engaged in the violence, right? Just like I see a small parallel, right, with what Deng says about some bad actors mixed in with the students. In Mexico, there were bad actors, and they were agents of the government, right? And they were sent there specifically to stir up violence, so the government could put down the students. So it's a whole different kind of outcome, and of course Mexico didn't gain anything for it either.
Well, it shows you the difference in the functioning of the political system, because like I think one thing Deng always stresses, and like so he's relatively diplomatic in his interactions with the West for a range of reasons, including economic relations. But one thing he always stresses is he's like, don't worry too much about what they say about you. Right. Yeah. He's like, they're always going to say like bad things. It doesn't really matter. Like, it's not that, you shouldn't like make our political decisions on that basis. So when you talk about this excessive concern with image, I think it's quite diagonal sort of to what you see. No, not that China's unconcerned about image. Obviously it is. But I also think that it sometimes betrays a willingness to pursue political objectives at the expense of that, for sure.
Yeah.
So that's like, and actually there's a few little notes I just wanted to bring up. He addresses this a couple times subsequently in different essays. Frankly, he says, the recent disturbances in the counter-revolutionary rebellion that took place in Beijing, and I love how you just take these words and like repeat them too, right? As your counter-revolutionary rebellion. Frankly, the recent disturbances in the counter-revolutionary rebellion that took place in Beijing were fanned by international anti-communism and anti-socialism. It's a pity that the United States was so deeply involved in the matter and that it keeps denouncing China. Actually, China is the victim. China has done nothing to harm the United States. Each country can have its own views of this event, but you cannot ask us to accept incorrect criticism from others. The American public got its information from the Voice of America and from American newspapers and periodicals, which reported that blood was flowing like a river in Tiananmen Square and that tens of thousands of people had died. They even gave the exact number of casualties. That's true, by the way. So it's just like, how do you get the exact number of casualties? Does anybody know? Like, there were in American newspapers, like that many people died. The Voice of America, and I also love when he takes his time out just to like bash random newspapers in the States or whatever. Like, it's just like, the Voice of America has gone too far. The people working for it tell lies. They're completely dishonest. If the American leaders determine their state policies on the basis of information provided by the Voice of America, they will be in trouble. And then he later notes related to this issue. So you see it as a recurring theme about America. Their talk about human rights, freedom, and democracy is only designed to safeguard the interests of the strong, rich countries, which take advantage of their strength to bully weak countries, and which pursue hegemony and practice power politics. We never listen to such stuff, nor do you. Even in the past, when we were quite weak, we ignored them. That was just so. And it's interesting too. You can see how old Deng is because he always goes back to the old days, right? That's like his not the Culture Revolution or anything like that, but like the real old days. You know, he always goes back to like the war, and he's like, he's like, we were tough. You know, these people fucking today, they don't understand. So he's like, we didn't give a shit about the States, and we were a pathetic, poor country. Like, why do you care? Like, turning the page a little bit. So now we're gonna go into the next one, but I just want to say before we jump into the Southern tour stuff, there's an interesting one here. I didn't cite this as something we should have read, but remarks made during an inspection tour of Shanghai. So in early '91, Deng goes to Shanghai, and he actually self-criticizes because he's like, I'm sorry I didn't get like some kind of special economic arrangement set up here earlier. And it's in this period that Pudong, I think, goes and becomes this major financial district, which it is today. So Pudong today is really central to Shanghai, but it's opened up as like it's given a special economic status, right? In that time. So one of the things Deng did was he kind of criticized himself for not having done this sooner because Shanghai lagged a little bit behind what was going on in Guangdong, for example, in spite of being this, being very important to China's modernization even before communism. But he says here, Jiamin became a special economic zone because many natives of southern Fujian have immigrated to other countries and gone into trade. However, we did not take the intellectual advantages of Shanghai into account. Since the people of Shanghai are clever and well-educated, if we had decided to establish a special economic zone here, the city would look very different now. The 14 open coastal cities, so these are cities that have opened up economically more, include Shanghai, but these have no special status. It would have been better to develop the Pudong district a few years ago, like the Shenzhen special economic zone. Development of the Pudong district will have a great impact not just on the district itself, but on all of Shanghai, which in turn will serve as a base for the development of the Yangtze Delta and the whole Yangtze Basin. So we should lose no time in developing the Pudong district and persevere until construction is completed. So long as we keep our word and act in accordance with international practice, foreign entrepreneurs will choose to invest in Shanghai. That is the right way to compete. Finance is very important because it's the core of the modern economy. Handling financial affairs well is the key to success in this sphere. Shanghai used to be a financial center where different currencies were freely exchanged, and it should become so again. If China is to acquire international status in finance, we should depend primarily on Shanghai. It will take many years, but we should act now. So he's kind of earmarking it as like the center of finance, right? So I told you before that in Shenzhen you have manufacturing and high tech, and in Shanghai I said you have finance, cinema, other things. I don't know all the details. I'm sure a lot more. And I said Beijing government, obviously, and certain manufacturing, like old school, industrial manufacturing. That's part of why Beijing's so polluted, right? But yeah, so you see this, which is actually the pollution thing becomes like a huge issue in subsequent years, and that's just like, I don't know, like I've never really experienced it. I was in Hong Kong, but I understand it's just like so much. Mexico City has like horrible pollution as well, right?
Yes, sometimes. My city also has terrible pollution sometimes because to the north of it, there's a quarry. And that quarry loves extracting even like late into the night, and they love breaking regulations. So we get a lot of toxic air.
Oh, fun. Yeah.
Yeah, have fun.
Yeah, no, it got so bad in China that it was really central to like I think in a certain way, there are different reasons, but I think in a certain way, that pollution, like it's accelerationist. Pollution got so bad that I think it helped create visibility around the environmental issue in China. Like, I'm not even kidding. Like, people are like, oh fuck, like this is so fucking bad. Because there's like at times you get warnings that be like, don't even go outside.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just like, you know, beautiful sunny day. It's like, don't go outside. You know, it's not healthy, right? You know, I mean, it's not that that's that strange. We used to get that in like Southern Ontario, which is pretty fucking putrid in terms of pollution. But because we're a valley, right? So everything comes up from the States and gets trapped in there, right? It's really good.
Yeah. Monterrey is a valley too, but you know, it's heading south instead of going north.
Yeah. I think I read that the worst pollution in North America is of major cities is Mexico, Los Angeles, and Toronto. But it's possible those stats are outdated.
No, Mexico DF is gigantic, so it makes a lot of sense. It's huge, you know. You can see my city like from one corner to the other, but if you stand any corner of Mexico City, you can't see the other corner.
Yeah, that's not good. So, you know, yeah, that's one reason. Like, you're gonna see, like, when we go into the sea stuff, like, he has this very, under the name, it's like it's extremely dry. Like, he makes Deng quite acerbic and witty.
Sure.
But Deng is like, he's not a bad, you know, it's been definitely better reading than I thought at first it would be. And I think Tim, you were saying the same thing, right? About Deng being better reading than you maybe anticipated. But yeah, like when you get into this, you'll see the way, I think what's interesting in terms of the essay I'm going to say about C is you'll see the sort of sweeping reform agenda and the way he lays it out. And I think it's significant in that way. So I just want to, moving on here, so let's go to excerpts from talks given in Wuchang, Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Shanghai. So this is part of the Southern tour that I mentioned earlier. Does anyone have anything they want to say about this essay before we start? I have a few points highlighted, actually. But does anyone have anything they wanted to bring up?
I mean, the main thing that I found interesting is that Deng kind of provides some explicit references to Marx and like places China's development in the context of Marxist theory a little bit more explicitly. At least I think that, and also talking about the, you know, it's pretty basic, but talking about the liberation of the productive forces and stuff like that, just to see it explicitly done like this, I think is very beneficial.
Yeah. There's some good points made throughout this. This is considered one of Deng's most important kind of moments, by the way, politically, because this was considered the moment in which like the internal party resolved itself in favor of like high growth policies. The Southern tour is considered the trigger that kind of causes that, and it's also considered like his sort of, again, like this moment. It's like his last hurrah, you know, and it was again showing that he could still impact the political system if he wanted to, even after Tiananmen and the discredit that sort of brought. But I think the United States had already shed sanctions by the time this happened. So I think when that happened, that also took the heat off a lot. So, you know, but he says, had it not been for the achievements of the reform and the open policy, we would not have weathered June 4th. And if we had failed that test, there would have been chaos and civil war. The Cultural Revolution was a civil war. Why was it that our country could remain stable after the June 4th incident? It was precisely because we had carried out the reform and the open policy, which had promoted economic growth and raised living standards. The army and the government should therefore safeguard the social system and these policies. So you see this thing, which I think is strong at this point, where he's actually beginning to stake the legitimacy, and this has become a mainstay of Chinese politics since, but he's actually beginning to stake the legitimacy of the party, right? And that's the main thing, by the way, that people like, usually like, if you look at how Chinese politicians present it today, they'll be like, oh, like, you know, they'll be like, the great thing, if you look at the enrichment we've achieved, but like also like Mao is sort of foundational and important. You know, so they sort of that tends to be foregrounded more than anything else. So a little later, he says he's talking about he talks about how some areas can develop faster than others eventually, but the system has to avoid polarization. One way is for the areas that become prosperous first to support the poor ones by paying more taxes or turning in more profits to the state. Of course, this should not be done too soon. At present, we don't want to dampen the vitality of the developed areas or encourage the practice of having everyone, quote, eat from the same big pot. We should study when to raise this question and how to settle it. I can imagine that the right time might be the end of this century, when our people are living a fairly comfortable life. At that time, while developed areas continue to grow, they should also give strong support to less developed areas by paying more taxes, turning in more profits, and transferring technology. And again, these initiatives don't really begin to get off the ground, I think, until the Xi era, right? Because when you're talking about inequality, for example, Tim, and kind of the beginning of that to reverse in China.
Yeah, here I can see why Deng is not very keen on the Western system of the three powers, because at least here in Mexico, with our current, left-wing administration, we're seeing a lot of this kind of policy, right? We're gonna tax the more developed areas, and we're gonna invest in the less developed areas, right? And what does federalism do? It turns this policy into a matter of electoral politics, right? And now you vote for the candidate who's against or for, raising taxes in your region, and it becomes a mess for development of the whole country. In the United States, that's a major problem too, right? I mean, Texas even lobbied its way into an independent electricity grid, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and these are the, obviously, one thing that Deng apprehends, I think, quite quickly, right, is like the capacity to use China's like more authoritarian system in order to engage in economic planning in a way that's like far more considered than what more liberal and open environments are doing. So that's that becomes a significant thing. But I mean, it's interesting, this question of regional inequality, because it's still a big deal. I understand that one of the big obstacles that has to be confronted is like the correct construction of a national health service, like a truly national health service. Now, China has like really actually. In developed areas, it has really developed health services. I think they have more hospital beds per capita per person in China than Canada. But as you can imagine, it's extremely inequitous, the provision of healthcare, absent something like a national insurance system. So, these are things that Deng's outlining. But I think like kind of what happens is like Deng kind of maintains these as notions, and then I think the people who succeed him, they. I don't think that there's really the will to like, fundamentally challenge that settlement. Not even that Xi upends it completely, but I don't think there's a will to really deeply reform it, right? And I think Xi's the first one who kind of comes along and is like, look, and you see this when we get into like the Xi speeches, where Xi comes along and he's like, look, we've done a good job in general, like whatever, but people have become complacent, and we have some serious issues we have to address. And if we don't address them, they're going to undermine the party, and the government will lose power, and who knows what's going to happen, right? So he presents these as like existential challenges, so I don't think prior to that it really reached that point. It's interesting that Deng says here we should address it before the end of the century, because it was not addressed before the end of the century, right? To what extent these issues are addressed today, right, is debatable. I mean, China had the big anti-poverty campaign, that's good, right? But let's remember that like, I think I don't know if you know this about Xi, but I think it's like the prime minister or someone else. Like, there's one of the top officials in China. He has like this acrimonious relationship with him, and like Xi will like direct the public broadcaster not to air his speeches. It's like this crazy like inter-party tension. And the one guy was like criticizing the anti-poverty initiative, and he was saying like that. He was like, look, he's like, they're saying like what is the global threshold for poverty? It's like $2 a day or something. And he's like,
198 or something.
Yeah, and he's like, look, we've eliminated like that. He's like, but let's not kid ourselves about poverty in a more general sense. He's like, we've got, a huge percent of the population living under $200 a month, for example, right? So, and I know like with the anti-poverty initiative, I think it's good, by the way, that is good that they've achieved that. That's something. But the point is there are still stark inequalities and there are some ominous things like the removal of references to poverty in official documents and stuff like that. You know, which is a little bit strange because you should be using two standards of poverty. You should be using international standard and a national standard, right?
Right.
China's national standard isn't going to be as discrepant with the international standard as like Canada's is going to be. But I think it's still reached a point where it's going to be somewhat discrepant, right? You know, maybe to the tune of raising the bar, I mean, like, obviously, like to the tune of raising the bar significantly. And I don't mean just on the level of like, you could say, well, socialists, we should eliminate, inequality period or whatever. But I just mean as a strategy of completely pragmatic governance, right? That there should be an international poverty elimination objective, but also a national poverty elimination objective, right? Which is
that's how you deal with crime. Otherwise, you get rampant crime and corruption.
Yeah. So when I say deliberately, when I say that I don't think it's still this year that these things begin to be addressed, though there are little things like in the Hu Jintao era, they start to expand for a long time, like state organized enterprises had become less and less important to the Chinese economy. But even a few years before Xi, that starts to turn around and they're like, oh, like in the mid 2000s, they're like, oh, maybe we should like stop reducing the importance of SOEs to the overall economy. Right. So there are little signs and premonitions before, but I don't think it's until Xi that there's a strong reform mandate that's brought in. And I say reform for a reason, right? Because I think Mao and Deng were both like, very different and very brazen leaders in terms of the kind of agendas they carried out.
Yeah.
I think Deng was subtler in terms of how he presented it, but nevertheless, but I think that Xi, it was like the system is fundamentally working, but look, there's some serious problems, right? And corruption, by the way, is often listed as the number one, right, in China. You got to look at the national priorities. I mean, I think I understand corruption and the environment are often listed among the highest problems in China. Yeah. I think also the weakness of social services is criticized. But it's interesting because a lot of this gets technically local governments have responsibility for a lot of things. So the paradox of like the weird downloaded system is that a lot of the flack for this is taken by local governments. What's funny in China, the local governments are democratic, but if you poll people on their opinions, they like hate the local government. Well, not hate, but they're like quite relatively whatever to the local governments. I think they're like half support. But if you go up to like, see, it's like, like, I don't know, it was like 90 or something insane. I mean, like studies that have been vetted by Harvard, by the way, not like internally invented statistics, right? So actual credible studies, which makes sense because like, I think it's funny when people act surprised that in China support for the government's that high. It's like,
I mean, for the federal government, it makes sense that it's going to be high, right?
Yeah, well, it makes sense for a number of reasons, right? It makes sense because they have been fairly effective in a lot of respects in terms of enriching the country.
Yeah.
But also just because when you're a poor country and when you're successfully pursuing that program, growth is happening so fast and it's transforming people's lives so fast. I mean, for a lot, again, maybe working class purchasing power or whatever hasn't increased as much as you'd hope, but which has to do with the cheap labor strategy. But if you look at like the whole society and different social classes, the advancements have been huge, disproportionate, but huge in any case. Yeah. And a lot of people have just been like living every day and it's better than yesterday, for like the last few decades,
You can say the same thing about the United States during the 40s all the way to the 60s, and that isn't specifically right, like in support of capitalism. It's just development.
Yeah, it's development. Yeah, and by the way, of course, the United States, even in those years, I don't think its growth was similar because it was already like a wealthy country.
Yeah. But then it was the war economy, really.
Yeah. But then there are other things. There are other things you have to remember too. Like, so if Harvard University, like that's a study, that study may be true, but like you're still polling people based on exposure to media that's state controlled and stuff like that. Sure. Right. Yeah. That's the basis upon which their sentiments are formulated. So, there's a number of reasons. Another reason also is because a lot of the things people don't like, and I think the system's partly set up this way to sort of deify like the higher echelons of the leadership, and to assign blame for things more to like more local levels of leadership,
Mhm.
right? Which is also, I think, I'm speculating a bit, but I think it's probably also a strategy to insulate the higher levels of leadership from criticism, right?
Yeah, I mean, if what you're saying about how the local leadership is more democratic, it makes sense that people wouldn't like them, because democracy doesn't always play out, right? Like we expect it to, and under capitalism, especially so. So I'm sure that these local governments arrive even with small scale corruption, right? But enough for people to be dissatisfied, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think there's probably, I don't know, like the nature of the corruption's very different. It's hard to kind of speculate too much, but because we're probably dealing with qualitatively different kinds of things. I mean, local leaders, I think, end up often caught up in these very like banal, briefcases full of cash kind of situations. You know, I suspect the way that plays out at the higher echelons is different. It may not even be labeled corruption as such. But I think part of it also is like, if you look at this, even in Canada, if you look like when you had this like deficit warrior period in Canada in the 90s, one thing that was done was that deficits would be downloaded to the lower levels of government, right, from the higher ones, right? Which obviously is going to have the effect of paralyzing lower levels of government and diminishing support from them, right? So again, I think that in China, it's also used, I think, a little bit as a strategy, like to have like more politically democratic, like local governments, and then kind of like paralyze them a little bit, and then be like, well, we're doing pretty good at the top. but it does speak to the need. I think generally it does speak to the need for the federal government to assume a stronger mandate on certain issues related to social security, right? Which is, but again, it's a tenuous issue, right? Because if you mess it up, then you're the one who's going to take the blame, right? More than. Here we go. I just go down a little more. One of the basic concepts of Marxism is that the socialist system must be defended by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx once said the theory of class struggle was not his discovery. His real discovery was the theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat. History has proved that a new rising class that has just taken power is, generally speaking, weaker than the opposing classes. It must therefore resort to dictatorship to consolidate its power. Democracy is practiced within the ranks of the people and dictatorship over the enemy. This is the people's democratic dictatorship. It is right to consolidate the people's power by employing the force of the people's democratic dictatorship. There is nothing wrong in that. We've been building socialism for only a few decades and are still in the primary stage. It will take a very long historical period to consolidate and develop the socialist system, and will require persistent struggle by many generations, a dozen or even several dozens. We can never rest on our oars. So you kind of see Deng again, how he sees his position, right, which is a very, kind of Marxist-Leninist, right, view of it, right? Because, he has this tendency to conceptualize the threats against him, right, as having to do with the position that he occupies, in defense of a mandate intended to more widely enrich the peoples of China, right, and to avoid forms of imperialist exploitation and so forth, right? So that's kind of, but I mean, I guess his point here is it's not just like a question of the early, I think he implicitly is applying this to the present, right? It's not just a question of the early stages, right? What he's saying is like, we're still in a position where we're attacked, right? Because of the class character, right, of what our government represents, right?
Right.
Chairman Mao never held, I like this. Chairman Mao never held long meetings. His essays were short and concise and his speeches succinct. When he asked me to draft the work report to be delivered by Premier Lau and Lai at the Fourth National People's Congress, he said it should be no more than 5,000 Chinese characters. I kept to 5,000 Chinese characters and they were enough. I suggest you do something about this problem. So he's criticizing people for like having long meetings all the time, right? Formal bureaucratism, he calls it, right? Which does kind of it does kind of remind me, because the critique of bureaucratism is one of the critiques that's shared by both Mao during the Cultural Revolution and Deng after it, right? Even though they approach it from very different angles, the critique of bureaucratism and the rejection of also like relatedly the Stalinist command hierarchy model, right, is something that is shared, right? I think it's a mistake to think that Deng is totally uninfluenced by the Cultural Revolution. I mean, I think that it obviously sets the stage for what happens in terms of kind of hollowing out, the party. But I think that in a weird way, some of the ideas of the Cultural Revolution penetrate his rhetoric of market socialism, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he could have taken leadership of China if he hadn't been also reivindicating the Cultural Revolution at the same time.
If he'd also been what?
Reivindicating, right? Like defending it, making it actual again.
Well, he attacks it. He attacks it very explicitly. Yeah.
But he purifies it. You know what I mean?
He produces like an interpretation of it, right? Because like the Cultural Revolution was supposed to be this like gesture of like opening, and he just interprets opening in a very different kind of way, right?
Yeah.
It's like when he talks about like applying the initiative of the masses and stuff, it's a different interpretation, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's like, get on it, like let it help us build market forces to kind of develop. But the idea of leveraging mass popular participation, right?
Yeah.
It's interpreted by Deng in market terms, right? Which is but there's a certain rhetorical overlap. It was from the Communist Manifesto and the ABC of Communism that I learned the rudiments of Marxism. Recently, some foreigners said that Marxism cannot be defeated. That is not because there are so many big books, but because Marxism is the irrefutable truth. And I have to remember that, because that's like a Zero Capital Comrades classic. If Marxism, it can't be defeated because it has so many big books. It can only be defeated because it can't be defeated because it's the irrefutable truth, like the immortal science, as we say. And finally, here, I'm convinced more and more people will come to believe in Marxism because it is a science. There you go. It's great. Yeah. I forgot about this. This is wonderful. Yeah, it agrees with my drift. Using historical materialism, it has uncovered laws governing the development of human society. Feudal society replaced slave society, capitalism supplanted feudalism, and after a long time, socialism will necessarily supersede capitalism. This is an irreversible general trend of historical development, but the road has many twists and turns. I like his compromise Kautskyism here. Over the several centuries that it took for capitalism to replace feudalism, how many times were monarchies restored? So, in a sense, temporary restorations are usual and can hardly be avoided. Some countries have suffered major setbacks, and socialism appears to have been weakened. But the people have been tempered by the setbacks and have drawn lessons from them. And that will make socialism develop in a healthier direction. So don't panic. Don't think that Marxism has disappeared, that it's not useful anymore, and that it has been defeated. Nothing of the sort. And that is with that, we conclude my selections from Deng. I don't know if you guys want to add anything as regard the last essay.
Tim, do you have anything? I'm just going to check my highlights.
Yeah, I did the wait, did you the big quote at the beginning of number 6? Did we hang on?
Yeah, we just did that.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, threw me off for a sec. No, there's one thing I did notice, and that in the last paragraph he says Chinese style socialism. Is that the first time that's been mentioned? Like I highlighted that because I wasn't sure, because I always think of socialism with Chinese characteristics and couldn't help but have the associated thought.
What is he? Sorry, can you ask me the question again?
Oh, this use of Chinese style socialism. Last paragraph. I feel like that's the first time I've seen that.
Oh yeah, Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics. I told you about how that became a catchphrase, like haircuts with Chinese characteristics and stuff.
I remember.
Yeah. So I actually, it's clarified a bit when you get into the C readings, because like he periodizes it and he says like socialism with Chinese characteristics begins with Deng Xiaoping, and so it refers to like the policy of opening up and what it entails. And I guess part of the idea there is that, Deng often draws, like usually when Deng talks about the success of Mao, like the innovation of Mao, he talks about it in terms of military strategy, like the using of the peasants in the Civil War. But I think maybe the idea here, part of the implication here, is that Mao didn't succeed in developing like a model of socialist construction at the governmental level that was totally appropriate to what they were trying to do, right? Which is not to say he wasn't like a titanic historical figure or anything like that. But it kind of, I think this is kind of weird, like, because when you turn over to like when you get into the C, it's sometime later, like because this book, you're basically get like 2012, so you're basically picking up like 20 years later, and it's interesting like when you pick it up, because like they're just really candid about certain things in a way. Like they're like, socialism with Chinese characteristics began with Deng. This is the basis of our modern day prosperity. And, the market is more effective in the allocation of certain resources than the public sector, without saying the public sector doesn't have a role. But they're very candid about the importance of Deng, and very candid about their system being sort of like, Keynesian in character in a lot of ways. Of course, they still call it socialism, but you know what I mean? Like when they talk about the economic policies, that comes across quite strongly. So that is interesting. And I do think it's interesting here, though, that he says, well, like, communism has been weakened, but it hasn't been fundamentally defeated. And I think often when we talk about, like, the part of the good reason to do this group, I think often we talk about like the defeat of communism. Often we don't factor in Asia enough into that picture, right? So if you look, like, Nepal had, like, a successful Maoist revolution, and, like, you have all these Maoist groups, like, all over Asia that haven't been defeated, like in the Philippines and in India and so on. China continues, Vietnam continues. So it's what I mean, like, the defeat of communism, or the collapse of communism, as people say, it turns out the collapse of communism when China's still there. The collapse of communism it happened in what at the time was its most central economic corridor, right? Which was in Europe and Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Right? But I don't think it was ever accurate to say that, communism has fallen, because there was a tremendous oversight. America ended up having to strengthen China a great deal to play them off against the Soviet Union, right? They inadvertently strengthened, the Chinese Communist Party in many ways and helped grow its economy. America lost in Vietnam, right?
Right.
We still have all these guerrilla groups. So, again, I think it's overly trial. It's like it would even, at the time, and looking back, especially with the growth of China, I think it was overly triumphalist at the time to say, communism has been defeated. But I also think that it has to do with the particular drift of Deng's leadership. And I think that the policies of opening up had been pursued in a relatively uninhibited way, I think led people to surmise that China was simply headed in a capitalist direction. And I think that's come much more into question in the past decade.
Yeah. I mean, people still have the knee-jerk reaction that, it's not left-wing, right?
Yeah. Well, that's,
I don't know if you guys...
Left-wing is very general. I find that absurd. I mean, I think it's very certainly a left-wing system,
Yeah. Deng actually talks about this. He says, might as well bring up a highlight. He says, at present, we are being affected by both right and left, quote unquote, tendencies. But it is the left tendencies that have the deepest roots. Some theorists and politicians try to intimidate people by pinning political labels on them. That is not a right tactic, but a left one. Left tendencies have a revolutionary connotation, giving the impression that the more left one is, the more revolutionary one is. In the history of the party, those tendencies have led to dire consequences. Some fine things were destroyed overnight. Right tendencies can destroy socialism, but so can left ones. China should maintain vigilance against right, but primarily against left. The right still exists, as can be seen from the disturbances, but the left is there too, regarding reform and the open policy as a means of introducing capitalism, and seeing the dangers of peaceful evolution towards capitalism as coming chiefly from the economic sphere, are left tendencies. If we keep clear heads, we shall not commit gross errors, and when problems emerge, they can be easily put right.
Yeah. So no, it's true, and because of the, this is one of the paradoxes that Deng confronted, because he, in order to because of his own views, but also in order to facilitate stability, he really he worked within the bureaucratic structure of the Chinese Communist Party to try to accomplish this opening up. And but just because of the nature of what it is, right? And this is Oriana Fallaci brings this up as well, right, in her interview. But just because of the nature of what it is, it has a legitimizing function toward the left by the very fact of, you go to Tiananmen Square, it's adorned with an image of Mao and so forth, and this is our proud legacy. So it's the left, that impulse, right, in Chinese culture is very strong. And today, if you look in China, my understanding is populism in China today is mostly like neo-Maoist, right? Which isn't, maybe Commune magazine, right? But it's strongly nationalist and so forth, right? But it's nevertheless sort of left-wing populism. So, I mean, I think that in China, in many ways, they're quite paranoid in general. I think particularly after Tiananmen and after, the fusion, because in the early 90s, like in the Jiang era, they kind of opened up and they were like permitting more like spirituality. And then you had like this big Falun Gong thing. They had a big protest with like 12,000 people or something. And then you had all people, shipped away, and all this stuff. And it's like, they're paranoid in general, but I think in many ways, the fear, I think in many ways the fear is greatest to the left because of the legacy of the Cultural Revolution, which doesn't mean that in practice they crack down more on the left. I think if anything, the left is treated more leniently than religious groups or groups that are deigned to be religious extremists or the right. But that has to do with the income. But this is why there's a fear, because there's only so much they can do because of the way that it's built into their own, ideology and their own structure. Right. So it's like they'll go like, totally clean out and like shut down right-wing websites. We know with with cults and so forth, like how they behaved. And the Falun Gong is a cult, right? I think the leader's like radically homophobic and like pro-Trump, and it's just insane stuff.
Yeah.
But now they publish this like vitriolically like
they have a news. I have a news outlet, right?
Yeah, the Epoch Times or something like that. So it is. Yeah, it was just this disgusting,
Yeah. I've had that sent to me a couple of times.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate experience for anyone to have.
Yeah.
In my hometown, I understand they're distributed as well, but and they just diffuse like conspiracy theories about vaccines and like all kinds of stuff. Yeah. So if you look at, and I think it's funny, right? Because like you have like these people like they do these shows like these Chinese traditional dance shows, and they managed to like, even in Ottawa, my mom was like a diplomat, and they took like her whole diplomatic corps. I actually probably shouldn't say this. I'm not going to go on, but what I'm going to say is I know that in Ottawa, they I don't know about the efficacy of it or the veracity of anything I just said, but I know that in Ottawa, there's been a great influence that's exerted over certain politicians by these kind of groups. But if you really dig into their views, like they're appalling, right? Absolutely appalling. Yeah. So again, like I don't. It's that kind of thing. Like in the West, often we brand this as just like this like pure intolerance, right? But I don't know the kinds of like to what degree there was like more severe forms of subversion going on or whatever. But these can be quite serious social threats, right? And if you look at how widely conspiracy theories have been disseminated in the West, fascist movements and so on, it's really threatening the integrity of the civic foundation at this point. So. But I just want to say that I think if anything, they're more ruthless when it comes to how they deal with, the right and religious groups that are deigned to be extreme and all this. But I think the fear arises because of the perceived incapacity to behave the same way. So like when it comes to like neo-Maoist websites and stuff, they'll shut them off when there's high profile things going on, and then they'll like reactivate them a week later. They do stuff like that, right? They're not comfortable usually, like going full bore, right? On these kind of, like they'll like, labor activists, they'll like arrest them and release them like, a couple weeks late. I don't think it's quite the same, right? As the forms of repression that have been wielded against the right. And that has to do with the evident risk of appearing hypocritical with respect to, what the party is, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying they're also like, benevolently intentioned in that respect.
No, of course. Yeah. It's just different.
It's a brand. It's a serious brand issue. Right?
Yeah.
So, and I do imagine in general that like in light of their education, I do imagine that like even the most like, pragmatically minded sort of like neoliberal officials in China, I do imagine a lot of them have like at least like a smidgen of sympathy, towards some of these left movements, right? Because of the process you go through, right? Learning about this. But yeah, I think that's good for today. But so for the C, I told you I was going through it, and I like he has the famous thing there where he says, "Don't." 1 second, let me grab the manuscript. 1 second.
Yeah,
because I actually have a physical manuscript. So let me grab it 1 second.
You'll pull back the curtain and there'll be all 7 volumes. Just be right there. Just watch.
All right. It's not over there, so it's going to be your turn.
You see, I just have piles of it. It's probably the same.
Yeah, I actually just arranged my bookshelf like yesterday. So
See, I know I'm
very
gonna
proud.
move.
Like
soon,
they're all
so I can't have
the
it.
same height, you know.
Oh yeah, that's nice. How do you get them all?
Yeah, I don't
How do
have time to look for this, so I'm
Same
gonna pull
publisher. Same publisher. Yeah.
I'm gonna pull
Oh,
up the
okay.
I'm gonna pull up the digital version and just find it. The one I was looking at. Okay, just give me a minute. So actually, just one essay. It's a longer one, but just one essay because I really couldn't, you know,
Take it. It's a bit.
I couldn't figure out what to do. So maybe two we'll do. So one here we'll do reform and opening up. So this, by the way, guys, this is just so everyone's clear. This is from the Governance of China, Volume 1, by Xi Jinping. So after this, we're switching. So we're gonna do that. So you can get that online. I'm not gonna elaborate. It's free, even I hear in certain outlets. You know, you can follow along with us. But I just want to say here. So let's do. Let me just sorry. Just get it.
No.
The one good thing about this though is the footnotes are actually really good in the. Remember I was like complaining about the lack of context?
Yeah, in Deng's, yeah, a lot of hyperlinks, but going nowhere.
Yeah. Okay, I'm glad to hear there's more content. There's more editorial comment in this one.
I'm trying to find the exact part. Okay, maybe. Well, right now, let's just say let's just do one then now. Because I was gonna maybe recommend another one, but I can't really find it right now. But
you can put it in the description later.
Yeah, I'll put it in the description later, maybe if I find it. But the one that's important that we should really do, I think, is from December 31st, 2012. And look, we even get more specific dates here. It's a little bit. So this is main points of the speech. Main points. At the second group study session of the Political Bureau of the 18th CPC Central Committee, which Xi presided over. So the one, and I love the title, Reform and Opening is Always Ongoing and Will Never End. That is the title. It is always ongoing and will never end. So, and I think this one's valuable because it's a bit long, but he really outlines an array of reform priorities. So I think what it can do is like it serves as a more efficient, quite an efficient summary of all the objectives he's setting forth when he first takes power. It's a little harder to capture, to map like Xi's era because it's still ongoing. So like this book, for example, I think it came out in 2016 or something. So it just compiles like a few years of speeches. So I think it's a little bit difficult because it's harder to, the narrative's ongoing, right? It's harder to construct as a narrative, right? Than, to present as a narrative than the Deng or Mao stuff, maybe. But we're just gonna go for it and see what happens. And I think it's important to look at in any case. You know, we'll spend 5 sessions on this, and there are other volumes, obviously. But I think this is the thing is I think I want to focus on Governance of China 1 because it's a bit much to the other ones, but also because I think this is the one that's most widely been diffused online. And I want people who are doing this to have the opportunity to follow along with us without having to order the book from somewhere else, right? So I think that'll be nice. So is that good for everyone? We're good to wrap up now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So thanks, guys. Thanks for coming out. Not too many tonight, but thank you for seeing through the Deng era with us. And we will catch you guys next week on May 2nd. See ya.